Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each week of this podcast is either an interview with a guest or multiple guests or a solo episode where I unpack some scholarship in relation to computer science education. In this week's episode, I'm unpacking a paper titled Thinking Through a Lesson, Successfully Implementing High-Level Tasks. This paper is written by Margaret S. Smith, Victoria Bill, and Elizabeth K. Hughes. And there's no abstract for this particular paper, as it is relatively short. However, if I were to provide a single sentence summary, I'd say that this article provides a heuristic that can be used to prepare for a lesson. As always, you can find a link to this article in the show notes, which you can find at jaredoleary.com and just click on the podcast tab, or you can click the link in the description on the app that you're listening to this on, which will direct you right to the show notes. On my website, you also find hundreds, if not thousands, of free computer science education resources, including a link to bootuppd.org, which is the nonprofit that I work for and that powers this podcast, and a bunch of gaming and drumming stuff, literally over 1,000 hours of drumming content, because I create content for work and for leisure. So in the introduction of this short article, the authors provide an example of a math problem that can be solved many different ways. And so the authors are talking about how in these higher level tasks where there are multiple paths to coming to some sort of solution, students will need to draw on their schema or their different prior experiences and understandings in order to come up with a solution to the path. And there's not necessarily a right or wrong way to come up with an answer. They're specifically talking about this in a math context. However, when I read this, I immediately thought of like debugging or, just programming in general, like trying to come up with a function that will do a very specific task. There are many ways to write that function. Like, are you going to use if-else conditionals? Are you going to use case switch? What kind of loops will you use, if any? Will you engage in nesting? Will you call other functions? Like, there's many different algorithms that can be used to solve a problem, or in this case, create a function. Here's a quote from page 133. Quote, "The lack of a specific solution path is an important component of what makes this task worthwhile. It also challenges teachers to understand the wide range of methods that a student might use to solve a task and think about how the different methods are related, as well as how to connect students' diverse ways of thinking to important disciplinary ideas." End quote. This reminds me a lot of the conversations on rhizomatic learning, like the now 3 podcast episodes with John Stapleton appearing in it. Thank you, John. Always a pleasure to work with you. Where we talk about like different paths being taken. But this is a little more specific in that it's different paths being taken to solve a specific problem as opposed to guide your own individualized learning. But it reminded me so much of when I was working in the K-8 coding classes that I was in before I joined BootUp, where students would come up with such unique like little solutions to some bugs or problems they were trying to solve or just things they were trying to create that I wouldn't have ever thought of. Like, oh, that works. I would have done it a completely different way, but hey, it works the way you want it to. Every algorithm has an affordance and constraint compared to another one. But what's awesome about programming is there's many different solutions often that can be used for a given problem or to simply express oneself. Now, to help teachers kind of prepare for the many different solutions and paths that students might take, the authors created a lesson planning protocol, which, quote, "is intended to promote the type of careful and detailed planning that is characteristic of Japanese lesson study by helping teachers anticipate what students will do and generate questions teachers can ask that will promote student learning prior to a lesson being taught." End quote. Now, this is a really important thing to consider. So with project-based learning, one of the things that I talk about is the actual facilitation of project-based learning, or even like rhizomatic learning, is relatively easy to do. Just asking guiding questions, pointing towards some resources, connecting students. That is really easy to facilitate. However, the design takes a lot of thought and careful planning in order to be able to create experiences or spaces or projects that students want to engage in. But if you're new to the facilitating, it can be difficult if you're unsure how to guide students through potential problems or bugs that they might have or run into. So let's take a look at the figure that they have, figure 2 on page 134. So this is the protocol. So it's broken down into 3 parts. The first part is on selecting and setting up a mathematical task. Think of it as a computational task. I'll kind of adjust the wording to match that. The second part is to support students' exploration of the task. And then the third part is about sharing and discussing the task. All right, so I'm going to read off figure 2, and I'm going to change the wording so that it focuses on computing. Think of that broadly, whether it's computer science or coding or whatever. All right, so this is from part 1. Quote, "What are your computing goals for the lesson? i.e., what do you want students to know and understand about computing as a result of this lesson? In what ways does the task build on students' prior knowledge? life experiences, and culture. What definitions, concepts, or ideas do students need to know to begin to work on the task? What questions will you ask to help students access their prior knowledge and relevant life and cultural experiences? What are the ways the task can be solved? Which of these methods do you think your students will use? What misconceptions might students have? What errors might students make? What particular challenges might the task present to struggling students or students who are English language learners? How will you address these challenges? What are your expectations for students as they work on and complete this task? What resources or tools will students have to use in the work that will give them entry into and help them reason through the task? How will the students work? Independently, in small groups, or in pairs, to explore this task? How long will they work individually or in small groups or pairs? Will students be partnered in specific ways? If so, in what way? How will students record and report their work? How will you introduce students to the activity so as to provide access to all students while maintaining the cognitive demands of the task? How will you ensure that students understand the context of the problem? What will you hear that lets you know that students understand what the task is asking them to do? End quote. Yeah, so this is a really helpful set of questions to kind of think through, whether it's a task like the wording uses, or a project, or a problem, or a bug, or whatever. It can be used in computational thinking, computational literacies, computer science, coding. Honestly, I wish I had read this many years ago. Even though I did similar processes in terms of thinking through how to prepare for a project, these are some excellent questions to consider. So now let's talk about part 2, which is like supporting students while they're exploring the task. Again, this is from page 134. Quote, as students work independently or in small groups, what questions will you ask to help a group get started or make progress on the task? To focus students' thinking of the key computational ideas in the task. To assess students' understanding of key computational ideas, problem-solving strategies, or the representations. To advance students' understandings of the computational ideas. To encourage all students to share their thinking with others or to assess their understanding of their peers' ideas. How will you ensure that students remain engaged in the task? What assistance will you give, or what questions will you ask a student or group who becomes quickly frustrated and requests more direction and guidance in solving the task? What will you do if a student or group finishes the task almost immediately? How will you extend the task so as to provide additional challenge? What will you do if a student or group focuses on non-computational aspects of the activity? For example, spends most of his or her or their time making a poster of their work. End quote. Now, these questions are really good for thinking about like engagement and helping people in the moment. I would argue, however, it is much easier to keep kids engaged when they are the ones driving their learning. So if it's focused on interest-driven learning and students are exploring their interests, odds are they're going to be very engaged. For the ones who are not, they might not be engaged because they just don't know where to start or what to work on. It might be overwhelming for them, at least for some of the students that I worked with. And so just sit down with them and just have a conversation. What do you want to learn? What would be interesting for you to explore? You were interested in sports? Cool. Here's a neat way that you might do that. Or check out Susie's project over here. She's doing a sports project. Could you do something similar? How might you change your variation to be different from Susie's variation, etc.? But one of the questions that really stood out for me was what will you do if a student or group finishes the task almost immediately? That happened, the first programming class that I took was in high school. And it was C++. And the teacher is his first year ever teaching it. He had never programmed before. The school was like, hey, we want to do this thing. And the math teacher was like, cool, I can try and figure it out. I'll stay one lesson ahead of the students. So basically what he did is he gave us a month worth of assignments, and then myself and many of my peers would finish it in a week or two. And then we'd literally just play emulators for the remaining time that we had until we get our next set of assignments. And in case you're unfamiliar with it, playing emulators means we basically played like retro video game stuff on computers. So we'd play like Mario and like Sega Genesis games, etc. on our computers because we had nothing else to do in the class, because the teacher was not at a place where they could help us dive deeper into something, which is why I think it's important. Yes, you can get started and start teaching without knowing much about computer science and coding, but in the long run, you're really going to need to learn it and not just relying on the surface level understandings if you want to be able to help students continue to dive deeper, because otherwise kids are just going to get bored. I turned away from computer science because I was bored in class. I stuck with music and got all my degrees in music education because it challenged me. All of my instructors and directors, etc., were at a level where they could keep pushing me to be better and better every single time I showed up. Thought I had something really great, and then I learned, here's something else I can improve. But with coding, because the teacher was unable to push me on that, I was held back by that educator. Because I wanted to learn more, I would have gladly spent my entire month working on programming instead of half programming and half gaming if the teacher was able to actually show me how to spend my entire month on programming. I was actually planning on going into a career in programming and game development and whatnot, but then just got so bored with it. So yeah, okay to not know much when you get started, but you eventually need to know enough, in my opinion. And I know I'm very biased, especially because of my background in music education. There are very few music educators who don't have an extensive, if not multiple decades long experience making music before they started teaching music. I started late. I started making music in 8th grade, and most of my peers started when they were like 5, or maybe at the latest, like 5th or 4th grade. So by the time most music educators become teachers, they've been doing this for at least a decade or two, engaging in the field, even at professional levels. And that's not necessarily the case for a lot of the teachers that I see in computer science education. It's generally classroom educators or teachers from other subject areas, like myself, who are like, yeah, this looks interesting. I want to learn more, which is great, but it's going to take a lot of work. But anyways, I'll end my rant there. So part 3 of this protocol is still on page 134. Quote, how will you orchestrate the class discussions so that you accomplish your computational goals? Which solution paths do you want to have shared during the class discussion? In what order will the solutions be presented? Why? In what ways will the order in which solutions are presented help develop students' understanding of the computational ideas that are the focus of your lesson? What specific questions will you ask that students will make sense of the computational ideas that you want them to learn, that will expand on debate and question the solutions being shared, that will make connections among the different strategies that are presented, that will look for patterns, that will begin to form generalizations? How will you ensure that, over time, each student has the opportunity to share his or her thinking and reasoning from their peers? What will you see or hear that lets you know that all students in their class understand the computational ideas that you intend for them to learn? What will you do tomorrow that will build on this lesson? End quote. I love that. Not only is it like thinking of, okay, well, how will people be able to share and reflect on and kind of learn from or even compare with their peers, but then also thinking of, okay, where are you going next? Back when I was a music teacher, I took over at several different schools where like the previous general music teacher and band director, or even like drumline in high school, they would reach some kind of a goal and then take it some kind of like an extended break. Like, okay, we did our concert, now we're not going to do anything. And then same thing with like the coding class. Whenever like students would finish a certain number of puzzles in their puzzle-based platform that they were initially working on when I started there, they expected to be able to just play games for the rest of the day. It was like, no, sorry, that's not going to happen. It's very important to reach goals, to celebrate reaching those goals, and to reflect on how has your learning evolved over time, how does it compare to in the past, and then to set new goals. And if you're doing it in a rhizomatic context where everybody is going at different paces and working on different things, that happens immediately. Cool, you just finished a project? Okay, let's talk about what you learned. Now let's talk about what do you want to learn next. All right, now let's start working on that. The learning, in my opinion, never stops. All right, so the remaining sections of this paper kind of unpack some more things to consider around the figure 2 that I just read off. So I highly recommend checking this out. So some quick things that stood out to me is that this protocol wasn't intended so that teachers would go through and like write out an answer to every single one of these questions. It was intended to be used periodically or even collaboratively to just kind of help prepare for and think through things. Over time, this will become more of a natural part of the process if you do this more, speaking from experience, and it'll become much faster for you to be able to guide students on the fly. When I first started asking questions in the process while students were working on their own interest-driven projects, I initially was not very good at it. But because I practiced it every day and would often, like when I first started teaching, record my lessons and go back and watch them and go, what worked, what did not work? What could I do to improve this? It made it so that eventually I didn't need to do that, or it didn't take nearly as long because I could just reflect on it and go, oh, okay, this is what worked, this isn't what did not work, etc. Now, because I read a decent portion of this 7-page article, I will just kind of like read off some of the headings that come up in the next subsection. So one is on getting started, then on articulating the goal for the lesson, and then on anticipating student responses to the task, and then creating questions that assess and advance students' thinking. And then it kind of ends with a conclusion section and kind of talking about, well, what are the benefits of using this protocol? As always, I like to end these Unpacking Scholarship episodes with some kind of a sharing of my lingering questions or thoughts. I have a quick series of questions for you. So what do you use to prepare for process and reflect on educational experiences you facilitate. If you were to write them down and categorize them, or code them if you want to use qualitative language, what kinds of questions do you focus on more than others? What questions are missing? How has this changed over time? And where are you headed next? Now, I will include in the show notes some links to some podcasts that I've done in the past that talk about different questions that you can ask in CS education contexts. So make sure you take a look at that. But I hope this article or this episode helps you think through how you prepare for, process, and reflect on lessons or teaching, facilitating, etc. So I highly recommend taking a look at this article. It is very interesting. And even though it's written for mathematics education, this can very easily apply to computer science education. Whether you're brand new to teaching computer science or you've been doing it for a long time, I genuinely think this is a very useful article because, again, it kind of serves as a heuristic, a tool for thinking with or through, with a goal, quote, to move beyond the structural components often associated with lesson planning to a deeper consideration of how to advance students' computational understandings during the lesson, end quote. That's from page 137. And again, changing mathematical to computational. All right, so I know this was a short episode. This was a short paper, 7 pages with references, 6 pages without. Honestly, it's probably like 5 pages given some of the pictures and whatnot. Check it out at the show notes at jaredoleary.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing with a friend, colleague, or a random stranger on the street. Hey, person, you look like you'd be interested in this podcast. Here you go. And then skip away while whistling your favorite tune. Anyways, stay tuned next week for another episode. Until then, I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.